You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS here in Washington. Many of you will know of the AMTI, which monitors South China Sea issues very carefully from a number of perspectives, including infographics, analysis, satellite imagery, etc. So as you can see, this combination of experts is very good, and the timing couldn't be better because Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN this year. Indonesia has historically played a very important role in the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea negotiations. Indonesian diplomats have been very important to the whole framing of maritime issues. And of course, Indonesia itself is an archipelagic country with important stakes in all the maritime space of the area, but particularly in the South China Sea, and has faced some issues related to China's claims relating to the Natuna Sea. So all of this combines to make this very timely, topical, with real terrific experts. We are going to begin by having Suka, as she goes by, have a 20-minute PowerPoint presentation, and then we will move to comments from Marvin and Harrison, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and a hard stop at 1 p.m. So welcome, Suka. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay.
So they can hear you online.
Okay. Thank you, Satu, for introductions. What I'm going to talk today is about the South China Sea dispute, and I choose a title: "A Bridge Over Troubled Water." Right. So, who is the bridge? I'm going to talk about ASEAN and Indonesia. Okay. First of all, I would like to talk about the importance of South China Sea and why it is important. Why is being disputed? It's a overlapping claim by China and 4 other members of ASEAN countries. China itself claiming 80% of the area, more or less. And the ASEAN members are Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and also Taiwan. Is it become a dispute because they have an economic potential, oil and natural gas reserve, and also in terms of food security issue, fishery? It's around 1/10 of the world is reserve. Trade, international shipping lanes connecting European, American, and Asian trade route. Strategically also, it's surrounded by countries with rapid economic growth in Asia. Military and security, China built various construction in the artificial islands. Later, I'm going to talk about it. So, my issue will be, what are ASEAN and Indonesia effort to resolve the conflict? Okay. This is the map of dispute claim in South China Sea. It's red. It's come from the nine deadlines that's claimed by China. Yeah. So this is the countries on the left: China, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. Yeah. The area of South China Sea covering South China Sea cover more than 3 million square kilometers. Okay, as explained before, the trades also is very important. Trade routes from South Asia, from Middle East to America, and also to Japan. Oil and gas, yeah, all of this have a very good potentials in oil and gas reserve. Okay, so the problems start with 9 dashed lines that you can see here with red lines. It's previously, when it's introduced, it's 11 dash line, but it's up to 9 dash line. Then we know it now as 9 dash lines. Okay, so this is several islands groups, which is at least there is two big groups of islands here, Paracel and Spratly, and this is the colors represent the overlapping claims. It's with the Philippines, with Malaysia, with Vietnam, yeah, and also with Brunei here, and with Indonesia. Indonesia, overlapping claims in economic exclusive zones. So it's not in the, and it's after 9-dash line introduced, it becomes a problem with China. Okay, and also the South China, in South China Sea, like if we go to Vietnam, for example, you will never heard South China Sea. The people they usually say South Sea because South China Sea indicate that is your acknowledgement, yeah, of the it belongs to China. It's great for our competition here. We can see first of all what are China interests on the sea. China, yeah, here have started to build artificial islands with military equipment and also militarizing the sea and keeping away all of those fisheries activities that being conducted for centuries with the neighboring countries. Stopping oil and gas exploration within the 9-dash line. Also, China applied ADIZ, Air Defense Initiative zones. Yeah, it's mean that's any planes that pass by those areas have to report to China. On the other hand, also China conducted some activities that I can say it is a sphere of influence within the area. It's doing economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, especially it's very relevant with the concept of the project Belt and Road Initiative, including with Indonesia. And also all of those militarizing military activities with great powers competition with the US. Xi Jinping in 2021 declared that China ready to war at any time, yeah, to protect its claim. Okay, and other competitions also happens when Nancy Pelosi visit Taiwan in 2022. It's challenging the one China policy that's have been applied to People's Republic of China and not Republic of China. Other activities that's related to China established a community of common destiny, yeah, in 1997 and then renewed in 2018, gathering support for Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibetan issues, especially on human rights. The US also have interest in South China Sea. Okay, first of all, the US is supporting the freedom of the sea and freedom of navigation. It's meaning that the US is not non-signatory of UNCLOS. Okay, so that's become a problem later. And other recommend that the US should ratify UNCLOS for the good of solving the problems in South China Sea. The US also working closely with allies and partners to contain and counter China's hard and soft diplomacy. As we know, its US foreign policy have been heavily focused on global war on terrorism and the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So this area is being neglected for decades, yeah, until the US realized that this is the problems because US has no strong grip in the area. All right, then the US have conducted several diplomacy to have a bigger sphere of influence and to defends its allies and partner interest in South China Sea. Yeah, like attended the East Asia Summit, and then President Barack Obama also introduced the policy called Asia Pacific Rebalance, yeah, more rebalancing. That's not only focused on North Asia, but also on Southeast Asia, or we call it also as a pivot to Asia policy. The US also signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, sending US permanent mission to ASEAN, which is the only one great power to have ambassador for ASEAN, and built Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP with 12 member countries in 2016. The US also joining or establishing the Quad, with joint military exercise. Yeah, the last one was Malabar, which is conducted in 2020. And of course, the US also have AUKUS, the new security partnership with Australia, UK, and the US. In May 2022, US also established Indo-Pacific Economic Frameworks for Prosperity. This is the US economic cooperation in the region. And others is establishing Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is indicate that this China is become the US biggest challenge in the region. Okay, with all of those facts, then of course ASEAN is the ones who really have a direct involvement in the conflict or in the dispute. And ASEAN have conducted several diplomacy, whether is it hard and soft diplomacy within ASEAN, and also combining with ASEAN +3, and also inviting other great power, US and also China, for negotiation. But we can see here ASEAN members have conflicting interests, yeah? And it's become the sort of division. There is claimant and non-claimant states. Yeah? Claimants, like there's 4 members, and non-claimants, including Indonesia, it's half claimant, and others is like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. Yeah? And ASEAN have conducted several diplomacy multilaterally as well as bilaterally through the East Asian Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN +3, but ASEAN have no problem-solving mechanism. That's the problem. So if you're familiar with the gathering of ladies in Indonesia, you can say it's like arisan, just talking and then have some dinner party, and then after that, that's all. Yeah? There is no problem solving. Okay, and then other mechanism which try to be conducted is through the implementation of ASEAN centrality. So all of those problems of ASEAN should be solved by ASEAN members. ASEAN way, yeah, which is one of them, is consensus mechanism. This is also become a problem because of the division within ASEAN members. However, ASEAN have consensus before one treaty or one negotiation or one agreements being implemented. Right. So this the case is Asian Regional Forums to 2012 in Cambodia. Yeah, when the first time in 45 years ASEAN do not produce any joint communique. Because that is always happen after a meeting, a ministerial meeting, always joint communique at the end. But not this, because it was led by Cambodia at that time, and Cambodia is closely related with China, and because of the clause of the agreements have some points on South China Sea, so Cambodia did not declare that as a consensus. Yeah, do not agree to put the points into joint communique. It's going to happen again and again if we still apply consensus mechanism. All right, others way to solve the problem is conducted by the Philippines when it files the issue to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2014, yeah, and the result come in 2016 in favor to Philippines. It's mean that is the 9-day line is illegal. So under UNCLOS, the Philippines is the ones who have to be entitled to the Spratly part of Spratly Island and the Scarborough Shoal. So in other way of mechanisms, China prefer bilateral rather than multilateral within ASEAN because of course it can press it using the economic cooperation and economic interest, that is the case with the Philippines even after Permanent Court of Justice result. Yeah. Okay, so in March 2023, just recently, last month, Indonesia and claimant country conduct a meeting on South China Sea, but it's only with claimants countries. Like before, it's have to be always 10 members, but without any result. So how is it can be applied within ASEAN? Yes, it can be applied because the Greater Mekong Sub-region Economic Cooperation also it's within ASEAN, but only involving the countries that is have interest on the issue. Okay, this is the Indonesian interest. Yeah, Indonesia as a non-claimant. However, the exclusive economic zones is overlap with the 9-day line, which is claimed by China as a traditional Chinese fishing ground for centuries, what it say. Indonesia also the ones who initiate workshop on managing potential conflict in South China Sea since 1990s, is involving claimants, stakeholder, and academic. It's still conducted until last year, 2022. Yeah. But so far has no significant result because there is it's called 1.5 track. Yeah, so it's not first track because it's non-government, not second track also. We call it, or the Indonesia call it 1.5 track diplomacy. But I can tell you there is still a lot of problem, especially within with China's interest. Okay, why Indonesia is taking more stiff position? Because there is several incidents within the 9-day line in 2010, 2013, 2016, December 2021, over fishery, and prevented Indonesia to drill oil and gas inside the EEZ. Yeah, that is the reason. However, afterwards, Indonesia start to maintain its strong position, but President Joko Widodo, yeah, Pak Jokowi, still cannot move forward because, again, this is an economic interest, especially with the BRI project. We just talking about the fast train that is like between Bandung and Jakarta, which still have it's commissioned by the China. We have big problem with that because it's potentially become the next Hambantota, like the one that's we heard in Sri Lanka. Okay, Indonesia also de facto leaders ASEAN chairs in 2023. Therefore, the position will be very important if we want to solve the problem in South China Sea. Okay, this map is representing Indonesia archipelago. Yeah? So here we can see under UNCLOS, this is the Indonesian water with the green with green color. So within the green colors, it says that Indonesia does not have to negotiate or renegotiate its boundaries with neighboring countries because it's already accepted or already part of UNCLOS negotiation. However, I mentioned on my previous presentation that Indonesia share borders, land and maritimes with 10 countries. Yeah. So this is with Palau, with Papua New Guinea, with Timor-Leste, with Australia, India, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines, Brunei. Okay. Okay, so this here, you can see the next pictures will demonstrate this is the UNCLOS versus 9-dash line as introduced by China. So this is the 9-dash line with red color. And this is the Natuna Islands, where is it overlap here in North Natuna. So if you imagine that Indonesia has 17,000 islands. So one of my Australian friends asking me, if you living in 17 archipelago country, how you travel if you want to go shopping in next islands, if you want to go to school, visit family in the next island, that is not an issue. Indonesian islands are so big, even that is one country is from born, growing up, go to school, get to work, get married and died on the same island. So it's not true that if you have to jump using canoe from one island to another. And this is Natuna Island. Yeah, because of a very remote, I never heard about Natuna Island before. Even in 1975, when the place was become the refugees camp of the Indo-Chinese refugees, especially from Vietnam in 1975, before Galang Islands were dedicated for Vietnamese refugees camp after. Yeah, so. But after that, we never heard about Natuna Island. Once I heard about Natuna is when I have students from Kepulauan Riau, that's a Rio Islands University. Yes, she said she come from Natuna Islands. So, wow, Natuna Islands. I just cannot imagine Natuna Islands. So I said, have you go to Natuna to visit your family often? She said once a year, because it's so far, and the boat or the ships, Pelni, yeah, the national ships, only arrive once every 2 weeks. And it takes 36 hours by boat or by a big ship to Natuna Island from Kepulauan Riau. Yeah, it says close to Singapore. So even that, yeah, so if anything happened with her family, so she just let it go because it's 2 weeks and 36 hours away from where she is. So that is to say that this is a very remote place, and maybe not the population also not so big. So this is the exclusive economic zones, yeah, where indicate there is several activities going on here related to conflict with China. Yeah, when Indonesia forced to release Chinese fishing vessel because the traditional Chinese fishermen try to fish within or entering the North Natuna Sea. And then visit others is Indonesia forced to release Chinese fishing vessel, etc. And then also when China stopped the drillings and oil exploration activities, yeah, because it said it is within the 9-dash line. So this historical lines is a really still question, yeah, being question. What is the base of this historical claim? If we use historical claim, then we can also say under Majapahit and Sriwijaya kingdoms, that's most part of Indonesia, most part of those Southeast Asia belongs to Indonesia before. So if we use this historical claim, we can do the same, yeah, but it's not solving any problem. Okay, so what is the future for South China Sea? It's Richard Pompeo said once that China is a rough state, yeah, because it has been militarizing the sea, illegally claiming maritime space and resources, bullying rival claimants, and threatening freedom of navigation. On the other hand, when it tried to solve these problems or to negotiate the agreements, China also reject UNCLOS principle, reject the Southeast Asia Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, 5 principle of peaceful coexistence, ASEAN Code of Conduct, and the verdict of the Permanent Court of Arbitration, like what happened in 2016. However, this is another problem because economic interest with China also reduce the appeal for other countries to challenge China on legal grounds. And on the other hand, it's a continuing rivalry between US and China. And the question is, who's become the bridge? UNCLOS, unable. It's not accepted. It's not being recognized by China. Indonesia, in some way, they tried to solve the problem, but with first track diplomacy, unsuccessful. Second track diplomacy, BRI project, yes and no, and 1.5 diplomacy, it starts somewhere. And ASEAN also, so far, still cannot be able to solve the problem in South China Sea because of those division of interest and because of the differences between claimant and non-claimant status. Okay, thank you very much. That's for me.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate, first, your overview, but especially Indonesia's interest and some of the comments you made about Indonesian thinking, and I hope we can turn to that in the Q&A, especially as Indonesia goes to national elections in 2024. I wonder how much importance this issue balancing with the economic issues will play. So I hope we can get to that. But first, let's turn to Marvin Ott for some comments, and then to Harrison. Marvin, please.
Thanks, Satu. Dr. Djelantik just gave you a really good overview, and our time is fleeting, so I'm going to try to just do a couple very summary comments and hopefully leave some time for interchange. My basic perspective here comes from the last part of my government career, which was almost 20 years on the faculty as a professor at the National War College and Department of Defense. And I became steeped in the way that defense officials think about strategy. Now, I'm going to bring in just a couple of minutes of that to this question. ASEAN, taking this from the perspective of ASEAN, ASEAN has a strategic problem, an acute strategic problem. It wasn't always the case. ASEAN officials, government officials, like sort of a mantra: don't make us choose, let us be sort of neutral with regard to disputes in the South China Sea. There was a time when that worked. Think the period when Deng Xiaoping replaced Mao Zedong as paramount leader in China, 1980s, early 1990s. China's focus was on building economic ties with Southeast Asia. That was in Southeast Asia's interest. It was a collaborative win-win relationship. China's maritime military capabilities were very limited during that period. This was a strategically benign era. The United States was happy with Deng Xiaoping's approach, happy with the way the governments of Southeast Asia were approaching issues in the region. This was a sort of Goldilocks moment, and it lasted, depending on how you want to, 15 years or so. That era is over. Compare Deng Xiaoping's articulation of China's strategy in the region, including the South China Sea, with Xi Jinping's China's rejuvenation. Now we have Chinese military bases, 7 of them, being built, equipped, staffed in the South China Sea. In other words, a militarization of the South China Sea, a buildup of Chinese hard power, military power, on a scale over a duration almost without precedent in human history. The latest Chinese budget, just released, has a budget for the military increasing 7.2% next year. That's in the context of a projected 3% growth in overall GDP. China is prioritizing hard power, and that is tied to a policy of asserting, Dr. Djelantik gave you a very good graphic of it, that the 9-dash line in effect is a sovereign boundary of China. The South China Sea belongs to China. Xi Jinping likes to state that the South China Sea has been Chinese territory since, quote unquote, ancient times. That is, as a factual matter, pure baloney. But what this then adds up to is, from a strategic standpoint, the CIA, when they convene analysts to talk about a problem area, the first question is, what's the driver of change and what creates issues here? China is the driver of events in the South China Sea. Everybody else is reacting to China. And China's ambition and the muscle that is put behind that ambition is what is creating the current strategic environment. Let me just, in sort of 90 seconds worth, seems to me, in terms of strategic options that ASEAN has to deal with this very serious and difficult challenge, are basically 3, and they're all, pretty, all of you can sort of lay them out. First one is accept China's demands for strategic primacy, regional primacy, for subordination and compliance on behalf of the Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN to China. Now, from a Chinese perspective, this is natural. China is the largest country in the region. It is historically dominant. Its civilization has been preeminent. And if I'm Chinese, my message is accept China's primacy to Southeast Asia, accept China's primacy, and what you will get in return is a benign environment. We'll all get rich together. Harmony will exist within the empire, and we will all benefit. Okay? If you're Southeast Asian, you may, by choice or by conviction, accept that proposition. Laos and Cambodia seem to have taken that road. In the parlance of international affairs, that's called bandwagoning. We'll join the bandwagon. Okay, your second choice is the one that most of the governments in the region seem to have selected over recent years, and in the parlance of international politics, it's called hedging. Try to deal good relations with both sides, and try to negotiate some kind of rules of the road to keep potential conflict under control, and that's taking the form of the quote code of conduct. Code of conduct proposed by Southeast Asia, rules of the road for the South China Sea, negotiations with China, begins in 2002. We're now into the 21st year We've had an announcement out of the foreign ministry in Jakarta, and I guess out of Beijing, that the two sides, ASEAN and China, will quote unquote intensify negotiations to reach a code of conduct. Don't hold your breath. If anybody who understood Chinese policy, perspectives, and ambitions knew in 2002 that the code of conduct was in fact, put it crudely, a joke. China was never going to agree, nor will it agree today or in the future, to a quote code that constrains and limits its ability to dispose of power and project power in the region. They simply won't do it. But rather than say that, we'll continue to spin this out. We'll sort of, it'll be the carrot at the end of the stick, sort of. And we'll keep the Southeast Asians chasing this forever. And so far, ASEAN has shown a willingness to chase it forever. Okay, if hedging is, from a strategic standpoint, basically a failed option, given China's thriving ambitions, then that leaves you with a third option. And that is, in the parlance of the discipline, balancing. That is, you begin to look for ways to resist Chinese pressure and dominance. And if you're Southeast Asian, you have only one plausible way of doing that that will be effective, and that's to find a partner to strengthen your hand against a very formidable force. And there's only one partner out there that's plausible, and that's the United States. And that puts the whole strategic game now. And we're seeing it in the negotiations going on between the Philippines and the United States. We're seeing it in statements coming out of Jakarta, out of Kuala Lumpur, about increasing willingness to do joint naval patrols with the United States. We're seeing it in the Vietnamese agreement that the permanent secretary of the Communist Party is going to visit Washington shortly, probably going to sign a comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States. There are a lot of straws in the wind. Whether they actually add up to a real gale remains to be seen, but that's basically where we are. So let me leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marvin. That was also terrific. I just have to say that a couple of observations, the bridges that Suka offered, which weren't working well, are UNCLOS, Indonesia, and ASEAN. And you offered three: bandwagoning, hedging, and discipline strategy, discipline balancing. And I was struck that the bridges don't work, but the strategies all involve Southeast Asia making choices. And so your weight is on Southeast Asia having made the choice towards discipline balancing, which I hope we'll question a bit more as we go into this. But let's hear first from Harrison. Harrison, thank you for joining us today. Look forward to your comments on both Suka's and Marvin's intervention.
Sure, thank you for having me. I will also try to keep my comments brief, but I have a few thoughts here. I guess first, since we're talking about perspective, I should talk about my own. So I've been working at the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative for 5 years now. And as Satu said, we use satellite imagery and remote sensing data to monitor what's going on in the waters of the Asia Pacific, but especially the South China Sea. And in the past 5 years, I think what we've seen could be fairly characterized in broad strokes as China attempting to see how far and to what extent it can administrate the South China Sea as its own. And we've seen that in actual administrative steps, literal definitions of local jurisdictions that apply to reefs and features in the South China Sea and where they fall under Hainan province local government structures. But more importantly, we've seen it in the actions of the China Coast Guard, which is conducting daily patrols across the Nine-Dash Line and at key features off of Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And increasingly, it has been regularizing challenges to Southeast Asian oil and gas exploration activity. along with that, we've also seen an effort to control military activity and transit in the South China Sea, of course, with U.S. freedom of navigation operations being challenged by Chinese military, but more recently, air overflight with U.S. and Australian aircraft being intercepted by Chinese military in the South China Sea in what U.S. officials have called dangerously close intercepts. And I think for the U.S. and for Washington, many in Washington, maybe not Marvin, but many started watching the South China Sea in 2012 when China effectively seized control of Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. And after that shock, China's island building campaign in 2014 and 2016 was another kind of surprise. And I think that the South China Sea in the last 10 years has gone hand in hand with the United States kind of reevaluation of China and Chinese intentions with regard to the international order, with regard to U.S.-China relations, and its goals in the region. And so, due to that reassessment and due to those surprises, I think the U.S. has a much more urgent sense that, if we're caught sleeping again, maybe tomorrow the South China Sea is lost. And what does that mean? I mean, it means that Southeast Asian claimants lose rights that they're supposed to have under international law, but it also means that U.S. alliance credibility is subverted, and that international norms about solving disputes through the use of force are then kind of shattered also. So for the U.S., I think there's a lot at stake, and there's a very urgent sense of urgency that vigilance and a response to China's actions is needed. For ASEAN claimants, first of all, I guess I hesitate to speak on on an ASEAN perspective, but from my interactions in forums like these, I get the sense that from Indonesia, Malaysia, to some extent Vietnam, there's maybe less a sense of an urgent threat in that they're at risk of losing access tomorrow to what is theirs. But there is definitely concern about increased attention, increased militarization, and increased risk of conflict. And there is a concern about China pushing the boundaries in terms of restricting access to resources. But I think we've also seen in the past couple of years some element of a quiet confidence in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, especially. They've all continued oil and gas exploration. They all have new projects that are coming online this year, despite regular visits from the China Coast Guard. The Philippines is in quite a different situation. It has suspended its oil and gas exploration for many years, and is kind of daily confronting much more serious challenges from the China Coast Guard. And so you see the Philippines taking a much different approach, and one maybe closer to what Marvin talked about in terms of balancing, in terms of embracing its alliance with the United States. But I think, and my last point I'll just make is that I think this difference in urgency about losing one's interests in the South China Sea between the U.S. and the Southeast Asian claimants also plays into their faith in ASEAN as a potential mechanism for managing the disputes. I think most in Washington have very little faith that ASEAN is going to play a meaningful role in the near future in alleviating the tensions in the South China Sea. They see a lack of unity in ASEAN and a lack of consensus. And also, the code of conduct has really not gone anywhere. And they're not really holding their breath. I would be curious about other perspectives on this, but I think that maybe in Southeast Asia, there's a little bit more faith in the code of conduct that maybe eventually there could be some useful product out of it, but maybe also more importantly that simply the negotiations and the ongoing discussions themselves provide an incentive to not escalate and to at least keep talking rather than things going south actually on the water. So I think I'll end it there and we can go to questions.
Thank you very much, Harrison. There were some really interesting points in adding your layer about the Chinese approach of administering de facto the region, and yet some space, according to your comments, for South China Sea climate countries to continue with their energy activities, notwithstanding that Chinese effort. And the one exception you drew was Philippines. So we must at least recognize that the Philippines turnaround and becoming closer to the United States in this particular phase of its relationship with the U.S. has only been very recent. I would say changes that can be measured in months rather than in the last few years. So that I hope we'll return to some of that. Let me open the floor for comments and questions since we cannot get them online. And please be loud so that the microphone can pick you up for our listeners on YouTube and live stream as well. So does anyone like to start? Otherwise, I'll turn to Suka or to make some comments. Peter, did you want to have a comment? And then the gentleman in the red shirt. Yeah, please identify yourself, state your name and affiliation as relevant, and then pose your comment or question.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst, former diplomat and former NU professor. If you look at China today, there's nowhere else in the world where Muslims are brutalized more, where hundreds of thousands of people are incarcerated strictly for their religion, where dozens of masjid and madrasas have been bulldozed, where abortions are forced on Muslims to keep the Muslim population from growing, and where textbooks insult the Prophet and say that Islam is crap. Given that, I'd expect Indonesia and Brunei to be leading the charge against activities of China in the South China Sea. But I hear crickets. I hear nothing. Help me understand that discordance.
So Suka, maybe we'll come back. We'll take the second question. We'll come back to all the panelists. Please, sir, did you have a question? Yeah, please.
I have a question for Suka. Selamat siang.
Yeah.
I'm a student at George Washington University.
Welcome.
At the grad school there. I have a question in terms of the North Natuna Sea and also how the United States can be involved given Dr. Gowie's, I guess, non-alignment foreign policy. I find it very difficult for them to have Indonesia to have a lot of leverage over China given the amount of infrastructure and projects being built within the country. So the fear, I believe, is that, well, if they become even more strong against China, then they might pull out of those agreements. So that's an issue I see. I also see that maybe ASEAN does struggle sometimes. However, Indonesia is strengthening in what I see, like relationships with Vietnam in the area. Do you think the United States can get involved in a way that does not escalate any more tensions in the area? Maybe they can reach out to the Quad. I know that Indonesia is not a partner there, but I think there are many things that the Quad is doing in terms of maritime security that can help. I also know the United States is building a maritime center in Indonesia. So do you think, what would you say are the best tools and strategies for the United States to get involved with Indonesia without escalating any military tension?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Suka, initially, why don't we start with you, because both of the questions, all three of the questions really deal with kind of Indonesia, and then I'd like to turn to Marvin and Harrison for some comments as well, please.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, about Indonesia should take bigger roles to negotiate with South China Sea. I think that's what we have been trying to do. ASEAN, when is it leading ASEAN or become the president of ASEAN as an organization, Indonesia always want to solve the problems, but without any significant risk. For example, as I mentioned also on presentation about the conducting the second track diplomacy, I think that is the way, because there is a stuck in first track diplomacy. Government to government's negotiation is stuck, we cannot solve any problem. And there is also impossible to have second track diplomacy because this is a state issue. So the 1.5 track was conducted, but I also joined with the negotiation before, like when I was a undergraduate student. I was an observer, and I can see that you see there is some agenda of the meeting 1, 2, and until 10. But even we haven't go into the first agenda, China's delegates will always talk about something that is irrelevant to the issue, like whether this gentleman from Indonesia is entitled to sit here as a participant. And then talk again, and then until the end of the day, that first question is still unanswered, because that sort of things. Even there is also, I found on the books by Greg Polling, there is some it's funded by the negotiation. The 1.5 track is funded by Scandinavian countries. Yeah, so, and China reject if the funds come from US or from Japan. So, and that is the negotiation will not be going on if the funds of the meeting just come from certain source. Something like that, yeah. So even the UNCLOS verdict was refused by China. So what else can we say? So I think that is the reason why, for example, as Richard Pompeo, Michael Pompeo said it's a rough state and cannot use any international negotiations or regulation to solve the problem. Okay.
On the question on maybe Islam and also the economic interests that
economic interest,
Yeah,
of course, yeah.
mentioned, I think that'd be interesting to hear your perspective.
Yes, I also mentioned earlier that is economic interest playing a bigger role in the position of Indonesia here. For example, that's when Bapak Jokowi want to take more serious move to solve the problems, then he also have so many projects that is have involvement with Chinese fund, especially with the PRI. It's also happened with the Philippines even after the UNCLOS verdict, the PCR verdict. Philippines cannot use that as a leverage to take further diplomacy against China or to influence other members of ASEAN countries. Yeah, maybe I will.
Yeah, Marvin and Harrison, any thoughts on either of these questions and how Indonesia might be able to work its way given its interests and given its constraints?
I just wanted to underline Peter's question, because I've had the same question in my mind for many years. It's very striking. The U.S. is criticized regularly, publicly, virulently in Indonesia and elsewhere in Islamic Southeast Asia over U.S. support for Israel vis-a-vis Palestine, for the Iraq War, for the Afghan War, on China's oppression of the Muslim population in China, silence. And it's very striking, and it calls to mind two quick things out of memory. One is a comment somebody made in Southeast Asia, I don't remember who it was attributed to, basically speaking to US and China, said the Americans in Southeast Asia are loved but not feared. The Chinese are not loved, but they are feared. And you see that dichotomy playing out in a situation like this. And it also reminds us, I used to have regular lunches, conversations with the intelligence officer at the Malaysian embassy and talking about these sorts of issues. But the message I think I imparted earlier was it's time for us to see if Southeast Asia can assert itself, get some backbone when it comes to Chinese hard power and territorial ambitions in the region. And in the conversation, my interlocutor said, speaking for Malaysia, he said, "We are not bold enough." Well, we're seeing some boldness out of the Philippines now. I would argue you've seen it out of Singapore over the years. You see it from Vietnam. It's not like it's absent, and it's variegated. Each is in its own context. But beyond those three, boldness is hard to find.
Thank you, Marvin. President, any thoughts on both the BRI or the Islam issue or Indonesia's position on this issue?
Sure. Just one. I mean, Indonesia still maintains that it's not a party of the disputes, right? So I think there's still a clear incentive for them to maintain more of a background position on this compared to the other claimants that have potentially more at stake. Though obviously, you know, Indonesia is facing some of the same issues with regards to the oil and gas and fisheries in its EEZ.
Any other final questions? Yeah, Toya,
We
please.
have one question from an online viewer.
Sure.
It's from John Familla. He's a fellow for Advanced Vietnamese Studies at the Blakemore Foundation. He asks to everyone, if China is the driver of events in the South China Sea, how many other countries seize the strategic initiative instead of responding reactively?
Okay. Do you want to repeat the question just a little louder, Toya?
He says, if China is the driver of events in the South China Sea, how many other countries seize the strategic initiative instead of responding reactively?
Can anyone in Southeast Asia seize the strategic initiative on this issue? Harrison spoke to China kind of controlling the administration narrative, controlling the negotiations narrative to some extent with the COC, straightening that out. You pleaded for Marvin for Southeast Asia to get bold. Can someone get bold?
I'll just say, we're almost out of time. I'll just note in very quickly, not directly, but related, the Quad is an interesting phenomenon. We're now seeing Australia, Japan in particular, those two, India, more ambiguous partner, but Australia and Japan now beginning to assert a real strategic role, to become players in the hard power game in Southeast Asia. And that's new, particularly for Japan. That's a sea change. So things are happening.
Harry, before we close with Suka, because she is our Asian Studies Visiting Fellow, any thoughts from you on this question of, do you predict would Vietnam ever take the lead or seize the initiative to set the pace in South China Sea?
I mean, there was a couple of years back, there was discussion of Vietnam maybe emulating the Philippines and bringing a case, an international case against China's claims. Beyond kind of a chain reaction like that, where multiple claimants, were to follow in those footsteps, I think it is quite difficult to seize the initiative. I mean, the structure of the problem is that they're trying to maintain access, while China is trying to essentially achieve control over the area. So there's a finite goal for them, whereas for Southeast Asian claimants, it's an ongoing duty.
Suka, the last word is yours for this session.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Can Indonesia be bold this year in its ASEAN chairmanship?
I hope. Okay. ASEAN should take more bigger roles in solving the issue. So I think one way to do it is be more flexible with the what it's called the consensus mechanism. Yeah, because the consensus mechanism bring no any issue nowhere. Once ASEAN does not have any problem-solving mechanism, that's hard enough. And every problem should be solved in consensus way, yeah, with these divisions and different perception of the issues, with different interests, with different approach from China, with different economic and strategic interests. That will be no consensus on South China Sea. Okay, so and other points, the second point is if the US want to play roles, want to help or want to assist to solve the problem in South China Sea, first of all, the UNCLOS have to be ratified. It's have been trial.
By the US, you mean?
Yes, have been trial, but it never happened yet. So how can, for example, the US can say that China against the rules or against something with that historical claims or and that's line, if the US also don't have its signatory of UNCLOS. So I think that's from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Suka. Well, listen, first of all, let me make a couple of announcements before I close up this session. But first, on April 19th, from 2:30 to 3:30, we have a program on Capitol Hill. You can find the information online. We have a special session with our Board of Governors, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, David Stilwell, and joined by Senator Hilda Heine from our board. Also, will be speaking on the Pacific and East Asia in a special program on Capitol Hill. So please consider joining there. And on the next day, in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, we have our launch of our new Korea Matters for America, America Matters for Korea publication, as well as convening a number of U.S. and Korean officials and experts on the current state of the U.S.-Korea relationship. Really important in the 70th year of the alliance, and with President Yoon of Korea scheduled to be making a visit here to the United States just a few days later. And the final thing I'll just point out, also on our East-West Center website, but flag it to you, is a research, innovation, and collaboration exchange application. That's for ideas that we welcome from both Americans and regional partners to produce collaborative activities with the East-West Center in the research and analysis space. That could take the form of seminars, it could take the form of publications, it can take the form of a new website, but the idea is that something around which U.S. and Asia countries are grappling with issues. They can be governance, environment, contemporary security issues. So I did want to make those advertisements because that's part of my role and job here at the East-West Center. But I just want to say to Harris, starting from that end, Harrison and Marvin, thank you so much for being colleagues who will come to our sessions and offer comments to our visiting fellow. And I want to thank Suka for being here as our Asia Studies visiting fellow, long delayed by the pandemic and other issues. But I'm pleased that you were finally able to make it. As you know, the East-West Center's reason for being is to bring Americans and Asians together. And the ability to bring our colleagues here and for Americans to go to Asia is the central reason why we exist, to produce collaborative study, research, and exchange. So it's not just an academic act or a seminar act to have Suka here, but for her to meet with people like Marvin, Harrison, our government officials and others, to get her bearings in Washington, to learn U.S. perspectives, and then importantly, to share after that exchange her perspectives as a result of those interactions. So please join me in thanking Supa and the panel today.